Hey, this is Götz and I just made a video about building this DIY microphone tube preamp. If you have not seen it, I suggest maybe check it out first. This video will be really boring, just me talking and thinking about why and when you might want, or why and when you might even need this type of vintage style studio equipment, and when and why you better not want this type of equipment. And I'm not talking about this particular preamp, I'm talking about vintage style studio stuff in general. But let's use preamps as an example. Compared to my Apollo interface, they sound less detailed, less accurate, they produce more noise, and they can produce a lot of harmonic distortions. Then if they're so bad, then why do so many engineers and musicians like or even prefer these over a modern preamp? We could compare these vintage preamps and modern preamps, for example, to an old analog film camera and the camera in your smartphone. If you have decent light and a current smartphone, the phone takes almost perfect images. Great colors, great contrast, high resolution, and there's smart software running on the phone that reduces noise, takes out lens distortion and vignetting. So, if our phones take these perfect images, then why do so many people prefer these, let's call them vintage style Instagram filters on their pictures? Filters that add noise, filters that make wrong and unrealistic colors, filters that sometimes make the pictures black and white or even add heavy vignetting. Because it adds emotions. Because it makes the image look more interesting. It can even hide little problems. And it makes the image look larger than life. Let's take a vignette, for example. I'm using a vignette as a filter right now. This is without the vignette. And a vignette is basically an error of the lens that makes the corners of the image darker. And this is nothing you would use, for example, for landscape photography, but if you have a main subject like me, then this effect of a vignette helps to focus on the main subject. With music recordings, we usually want the same thing. We don't want it realistically, we want it better, we want it larger than life. This is why we record multiple takes and pick the best one. We double track everything, we quantize everything, we pitch correct with Melodyne or Autotune, we trigger samples or simply rent a better guitar for the guitarist. And by the way, I ran a recording studio for 10 years. If a band tells you, hey, we want to sound the same as in a live concert, that doesn't mean they want just 2 guitar tracks and detuned vocals. That just means they want to have the same feelings and emotions of a concert on their CD. And you as an engineer has to figure out and pull out all the tricks to transport this feeling onto a low volume recording. But what does it have to do with all this vintage style equipment? Well, until the 80s, even mid 90s, all recording studio equipment was analog. You recorded through an analog recording desk onto analog tape, and when you did the mix down back from the analog tape through the recording desk, analog compressors, analog EQs, and usually recorded onto an analog, let's say a half-inch mastering machine. And all these analog devices added a little bit of less details, a little bit of more harmonic distortions, a little bit of noise. The signal got a little bit worse, you could say, with every step. Back then, of course, everyone was fighting these technical limitations and was aiming for this pristine and perfect and noiseless sound. And if you did your job well, then you, without even knowing, earned a little bit on these limitations, because super harsh and not nice transients got smoothed a little bit down, because harmonic distortions can add a little bit to the sound, make it sound a little bit more full or interesting, especially if you have just average speakers. For the same reasons that people today still or again prefer vinyl recordings over MP3 or CDs. In the end, the recording would sound larger than live, would sound more interesting. Today, you of course record straight into your computer, and this will keep your recordings noise-free and perfect from the beginning to the end. And while this is nice not to having to fight against noise, it may also produce a less interesting and less larger sounding end product. And of course you can do a lot with plugins today. It's still nice to have a preamp where you can record multiple sources through to add a little bit of these harmonic distortions that simply sound good for the human ear. Of course, this highly depends on the genre of music that you're recording. If you're, let's say, doing high quality acoustic recordings or a classical orchestra, you want it as clean and detailed as possible. Because your mics are usually multiple meters away from the musicians, you're fighting for details. So you do not want these less detailed sounding vintage preamps. But for rock, pop, metal, indie and all the other genres, I think having a little bit of vintage sound is a good thing. And I think there are two main reasons. The first one is a lot of music genres appeared in the 70s or 80s and the 90s. And a lot of people are used to the sound of this era. And this was, of course, the era of analog equipment. And they are used to it. And it's always good to give people a little bit of something that they are used to. And a vintage style equipment is one way of doing it. Second reason, zeitgeist. Everyone uses digital recordings, uses the same synthesizer plugins, the same DAWs, the same effect plugins and the same samples. Everything sounds the same. The McDonald's burger tastes the same around the world. But the zeitgeist right now is having something that's handmade. And this is why McDonald's numbers are falling for a couple of years. And all these little burger joints pop up that hand make their burgers. They even hand print their menus or write in chalk on board because it has to be a little bit handmade. And the same goes for music recordings. Producers and musicians record less tracks, use vintage equipment, use, for example, no plugins but modular synthesizers to give their recording some uniqueness that no one else in the world has. This, of course, can and will probably change. Who knows? In 10 years, we like the digital and clean sound again. Who knows? Okay, back to the main question. When do you want this type of equipment? When do you need this type of equipment? And when do you not want this? First of all, do you really need it? Well, no. A lot of these harmonic distortions you can get with a plugin. And having the right equipment should always be a nice bonus, but should never be the limiting factor of not doing something. So if you don't have it, use a plugin, of course. Then think about what inspires you. Does recording into a computer really inspires you as an engineer or as a musician? Or would you rather have some knobs and something that you can feel? Would you rather have something that's a little bit random, like a modular synthesizer? If this is the case and you're spending money anyways, then get yourself a vintage style preamp or a vintage style analog hardware compressor. So you can mix and match and try what works and where you rather use the clean and digital version of it, for example. There is one instance where you actually need this even more than for inspiration. If you're having and running a studio and you want to sell your studio, let's say to a band, you want to rent it and sell them the studio time, then the band, of course, will ask, hey, do you have this or this type of equipment, this type of compressor, for example? And you say, yeah, sure, I have the plugin. The band's doing their own recordings anyway. They also have the plugin. So that's not an argument, not a plus point for you to sell your studio. Maybe you could sell, yeah, of course I have this compressor. I have the analog version, and the band will say, ooh, that's cool. And you can say, and I also have a vintage tube preamp and a non-tube preamp, so we can mix and match. In that case, having equipment is something that could be a selling point. Here you'll find more DIY audio equipment videos in English. What do you think about this vintage stuff? Do you have vintage equipment, or do you think, that's something stupid? Please leave a comment, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers from Cologne. My name is Götz. Ciao, ciao.